Welcome to the SARE Ladies Podcast. This is where Asian American Pacific Islander women carve out their own space in real estate and shake up the status quo. Join your hosts, Anita Wong and Ashley Cow, as they dive deep into bold strategies, personal growth, and everything it takes to own it. From building wealth to boosting confidence. Let's jump in. Hey everyone, it's Anita from the SARE Ladies Podcast, and I'm super excited to be bringing in Gary Kwan, who is a licensed therapist of 20 years and the author of Asian American Chronicles, to talk about Asian American mental health. So mental health is particularly relevant in entrepreneurship and investing and leadership because so many of us are navigating the pressure, responsibility, and financial expectations while also trying to build wealth and ownership. And I think for AAPI women in particular, we're not just inheriting property or money, but also emotional beliefs around sacrifice, around safety, responsibility, and worth that has really been built into us as the good daughters. And so we're here to talk about just that, talk about even in 2026, how there are gaps in Asian American mental health. And so this is a great conversation. Without further ado, here we go. Well, hi, Gary. So excited to have you. So I'm not sure if everyone knows, but Gary Kwan and I go back long ways. Gary used to be my old youth counselor, but through the years, I don't think I've actually. I actually ran into Gary a couple months ago, and he told me that he wrote this book called the Asian American Chronicles. And so I called him, this AAPI month is Mental Health Month. And so I thought it was a really great intersection. And so I called Gary up to talk about this particular subject. But super excited to have you on, Gary. This is full circle for me. And, and just for the record, you can tell the world, what was I like as a kid?
I always good to meet you, Anita, again, and Ashley. Good to meet you for the first time. Anita was a great kid, but I'm also saying that as someone that's firmly stuck in Gen X, that's probably disrespectful to say good kid. So, but I always found Anita to be very respectful and loving, and I just it's weird to think about it this way, but as a youth counselor, Anita wasn't one of the ones I was necessarily worried about in terms of behavioral stuff or getting into drugs or alcohol, depending how your audience feels about that. So I was not too terribly worried about any of those vices, but more towards like having good healthy people around Anita. And it looks like that you've got your own tribe, and it's pretty cool to see you all grown up, if that's okay to say on your podcast.
So if my kids are hearing this, just saying I was a good kid through and through. It's a testimonial now on the internet, so it has to be fact.
Yes.
So Gary, tell us about yourself, about the book, Asian American Chronicles, and what led you into working in this AAPI mental health space.
Sure. I've been in the field licensed for roughly, at least intern and licensed for about almost 20 years now. And as I've covered in the book, in terms of storytelling, my origin story looks a lot like I imagine some of your audience's origin stories, which is wildly successful in high school, number 11 in a class of 1,000 people. Went to college, paid for my own college, was on my own since 18, supporting myself through a lot of loans back then and a lot of part-time jobs. And then after college, starting doing consulting. As boring as this sounds, I was an internal auditor or a controls auditor, which is just like looking at IT controls and making sure that companies would not be doing anything bad. And this was in the era preceding, Enron and some of the other maybe companies that your audience may have heard about that committed a lot of financial and fiduciary crimes. And then a couple of things happened, or actually three major things happened. One, my grandmother, Su Ling Tang, died on my birthday in 2000, on April 17, 2000. And then at the same time, I was really disillusioned with the 95% travel issue with my agency. And so I wanted to be home more often to celebrate and be around my people. And then the third part was that along that lines, with the consulting job that ended, this was the 2000 bubble. And so I joined a company called Broadvision, and I was surprised to hear that a good friend of mine still remembers that company, and they laid me off within a period of 8 months. And so it was just a very tumultuous period of three major setbacks. And the other one, and thank goodness Anita was not around for this one, but I was in a really tough relationship with someone at my church, and I would say neither of us was healthy for each other. But in particular, that I found this person to be much later on, after my own therapy, like someone that resembled a lot of my upbringing, which is distant, contentious, a lot of discord. And so I ended up dating some version of my possibly mom or dad. And if you follow Freudian psychology, that kind of fits. And so I knew I needed therapy, and yet I couldn't find more than like two male therapists. I wanted two Asian male therapists, and so they both happened to be in San Francisco. And one I did not vibe with. I guess that's the term that the kids use nowadays. I didn't vibe with that person just because I didn't feel like they were interested in what I was suffering from. But the other one, to this day, I owe a lot of debt to Sam Leong. He's a psychologist that is famous here, not famous, but like really well known here in the Bay Area. And he just listened. He did a lot of listening and supporting, and no judgment. And it just felt almost like I had the therapeutic uncle figure that I always needed, that could speak my language. And so as a result of that, I was, they say, single as a Pringle. And so one Saturday, my one of the deacons at my church says, "Well, you're not doing anything today. Stop chasing skirts. So come to seminary with me." And I was like, rolling my eyes. But I went to the first class, which was a Bible interpretation class, and promptly fell asleep in about 10 minutes. But after my little nap, I woke up and just checked out the catalog and saw family systems therapy. And I'm like, what is family systems therapy? And long story short, that was the beginning of my journey going into grad school, but also really important, investing into my own now future, but now it's my current time frame. And it took falling asleep in a Bible class to sort of wake myself up to the potential to go to grad school and learn more about this stuff. And so to this day, and part of from there, took 6 years for grad school, was finally laid off from my final tech company in 2008. And that was the impetus to go headlong into my career. And it came with a lot of struggles. Certainly, one of the things I wanted to point out was that the genesis of this book started much later. It started right in the middle of COVID, with my mother calling me in the middle of like a random day and telling me I'm done with them. And I was like, who's them? Like, are we talking my sisters, or are you talking dad? And she says, all of your trophies, like I need them out of the house now. So I was one of those kids that got all of the spelling and math and academic triathlon trophies. And so it broke me that my mom was saying that essentially I don't want these in the house anymore. And so my spouse looks at me as like, what are you crying about? Like, this is, it's good, right? You get to bring these things home. And when I told them that, listen, like it's like being told none of this mattered, and it kind of set in for them, right? And so that was one of the biggest things. And then my sister, like I mentioned pre-show, she's an executive at a car company, but went through a really contentious and really bad divorce. And this speaks to the lack of support in general in a lot of our family systems and AAPI world. That I and my mom were the only people taking care of her kids during some really needy times, or needful times, where the kids needed supervision and support. And so, but on one of the trips back, I was just like exhausted, having still working full time, still seeing my patients, on and off, but really like taking these about 9 days a month, traveling to like see these kids. And they're teenagers. They were taller than me. They were East Coast kids, so that they were not people that I was that familiar with after I helped raise them as little kids. And so I just cried out in the middle of an airplane tube, like, I need to do something about this. And so I'm going to write a book. And so that was the impetus of writing the book, particularly after a career where I'd focused on everything from criminal justice reform. I worked in the jails for about 5 to 6 years here in San Jose, trying to get the recidivism rate down. As I was doing all this sort of criminal justice adjacent work, the same type of patient showed up in my private practice or in my telehealth work. And it was usually like an API person, a son or a daughter, second generation, the parents had either given up on them or that they had failed to launch in the parents' terms. And so it's a lot of family work in terms of a field where most of our work is done individually. And so that's been a lot of the threshing for me, is trying to bridge that gap between the suffering individual, but also that they're coming from other fellow sufferers that just happen to maybe make 800K a year working at Intel or Adobe, right? So there's a real jarring difference between what I typically studied in school, which is lower SES patients that were just struggling and having trouble paying their bills and those sort of things, to folks that were largely living okay enough, living in some of the enclaves that we have here, Palo Alto, Menlo Park. One particular patient was like the vice mayor of a city that's in the North Bay somewhere, but they couldn't be seen going to a therapist because it's embarrassing to their city. And so he and his wife would drive the 2 hours down to San Jose for therapy. So a lot of stories like that. So but I wanted to give you sort of the breadth of what drove me into the industry, and particularly the API focus. And to this day, I have a lot less hair since I was 26 when I first started school, but I also I find myself really coming alive trying to help solve problems that have not been truly solved yet in the field as it pertains to API folks. So I'm a professor. Yeah. I can talk for ages, but I appreciate that. It's a really good question.
No, I love that. And, I kind of want to talk about, so when did you begin to realize from the patients that you were beginning to see that some of these struggles weren't isolated issues, but these were cultural things? And in what particular, I mean, we're in 2026. How is there still a gap living in the API, in the sphere?
Yeah. The two main issues there that I'm seeing, and part of it's I'm kind of jealous because you all have sort of made your SARE field into several thousand followers or listeners, and for me, the marketing and the advertising were simply not my strong suits, and so many people have found me through word of mouth or past presentations. But I love doing the work, but I'm also still a shy, introverted guy, and so it's been tough to try to balance the two. But I was seeing a lot of folks that particularly wanted therapy for a specific set of reasons. And granted, like we have this, that's called the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Disorders, Mental Health Disorders. And so it's like our DSM Bible. But the majority of the ones that involve API typically were like no more than 3 or 4 reasons. And one was family discord. Two was this, I call it an untraversable divide between the first generation or generation 1.5, those that came here or immigrated here during school, and then it's their children, or that the children had frankly emancipated themselves and they were doing okay enough, but we're dealing with the aftermath of like rejection and pain and trauma from either rejection from their families, or their specific subpopulations, Anita and Ashley, here in the Bay Area that, just to share a few. One is those that end up being suicidal or self-harming because they feel like they can't keep up with other high schoolers or college folks. There's also another group that the intersection of Asian, but also Christian background, Judeo-Christian background, that just feel like they don't belong in either. And then a third group that has unfortunately fallen through the cracks and tends to have more what we would call severe mental illness. But I always wanted to find the in terms of etiology, like trying to discover the starting points for these. And it often looks like disrupted attachment between the parents and the kiddos. And the hard part to this is that oftentimes the parents, especially if the kids are younger than 15 or 14, or in California, it's really age 12, they have every say in terms of like whether they pay for the therapy, in terms of trying to influence what's being covered in the therapy sessions. And it's often related to, I'd like to get my little Ashley back into UC Davis because they're taking a gap year, or I'd love for Anita to like get over her depression so that way she can go back to USC. And so those secondary, I call them secondary, even though you can't get the families to deviate from that, but those secondary gains look a lot like my kid is no longer struggling or suffering, but they're back at Sac State, they're back at San Jose State. And the big as if there, and I do call it an as if, is that once they get back into education, higher education, that and from what I perceive of the parents, solves everything, solves all the problems. But it's until the next issue, which is I can't marry my daughter Ashley off, or I can't marry my son Gary off. They're single as a Pringle. And so what I determined to be really important is to look at how the API lifespan needs to look like. And so in the final chapter of the Asian American Chronicles book, there's a very tabular design of what the lifespan could look like. And I'm not trying to proselytize people on that, but just using all of the wealth of patient experiences or client experiences of the folks I've been privileged to work with, being able to define what are the important things to do in certain life stages, because we are losing so many folks primarily to the tent poles of mental health, depression, and anxiety during these critical stages where it just seems like other cultures or those other people, we won't say which people they are because it could be anybody, that they seem to be doing better than our API kids. So there's that comparison bug as well.
Yeah. So what do you think people misunderstand the most about AAPI mental health?
Yeah, I've got I'll just show you my little cheat sheet from the notes from last night, but I do think these are truly irrational thoughts and beliefs, only in the sense of like, for the folks that have made it and they're not in therapy yet, it could look like this is a you people problem, or you it's your problem, not mine. And so here are just some statements that I think are irrational at the heart of it. Wealth sustains mental health, and that can be problematic or possibly controversial, given your podcast audience, because one story is I grew up very poor in San Antonio, Texas. My dad was adopted and took over my grandfather's store. My grandfather was kind of a derelict guy that was not an upstanding person in the community, and my dad, not knowing any English or Spanish, was able to run the store within less than 2 years. And one thing I noticed during this last trip after he passed away was like looking at the neighborhood around our store in the deep recesses of South San Antonio, there's real estate to be bought and to be had. So one idea could be that if I buy enough property in another state, maybe I need to relocate to Boise or to maybe the deep South, or maybe the Midwest. That ultimately wealth and ownership sustains mental health. So that I really do believe like that can be something that, if not paid attention to in terms of our own self-care and our relationship health, can go awry for many of us, myself included. Physical health trumps mental wellness. That's been something that's been pretty popularized, I think, in like athletic circles. And one of the interesting things, I was in a meeting yesterday with one of my former students, and their idea that they pitched to me was to bring in mental health groups into a boxing club here in the South Bay. And so I'm thinking like we need to be creative about the way that we offer these services, because one thing that's been sort of going around the interwebs is that being in shape solves depression. And as someone that's had depression earlier in my life and gets the occasional episode every couple of decades, I was in the best shape of my life at 25 when I had all those setbacks, and I still needed therapy and the guidance and support of someone that understood what I was going through. And so I don't see it as an and or, but I see it as a plus plus. The third one is we or I don't need therapy, but those people do, right? Whoever those people are, that could be a different ethnic group, that can be it could be men. All those men need therapy because they just haven't helped them. They just stink, right? And so there's an othering of people that we might think need therapy more than us. There's also productivity and achievement fends off setbacks. So what I want to say again is productivity and achievement tends to hold off us from suffering setbacks. And as someone that's been laid off 4 times in my tech career, like, again, those are all not necessarily productivity issues, but issues with companies, as we're seeing now with Meta and with Oracle a few weeks ago or several weeks ago. This is we're just trying to maximize our profits, and I'll cut Ashley and Anita's and Gary's department, right? And so those things are very controversial to talk about because so many of our adult people are suffering, as perhaps maybe some of the people in your audience, but it's there. My understanding is Meta had its best quarter performance in years and still chopped 8,000 people. And so I think people are really becoming disillusioned with the systems that are in place, and buying property can make a lot more sense, being able to hold on to something tangible, than a position where you might be cut even after a successful quarter or semester. Which leads me to the next one. Prior success plus the absence of struggles prevents mental illness. And so one of the unfortunate things, and I won't speak to our people for this particular example, But the onset of really serious issues like schizophrenia, which is a thought disorder type of setback, as well as delusional content, as well as hallucinations. The onset typically happens during the pre and during college years. And so you may have these really successful Asian teens, and then they have some sort of setback that might be both biological, but sometimes it's related to past trauma being reinstated in their lives. And also bipolar 1, which is the one particular bipolar disorder that has manic episodes as part of it, that the first time suffering for a lot of folks is typically between 17 and 20. And those are the prime years for so many of our, I know, Anita, you're a parent. Like, I think one of the precautions is that we do all the cautionary work and all of the uplift and all the encouragement between K through 12. And when these folks launch, that's actually the time where perhaps they need the most support during their first couple of years in college or post-grad.
Yeah, I love that. And that's really a concise way to kind of put all these things, and I totally see the manifestation of all these things within real estate, right? People wanting to come to real estate as financial freedom is like a big term. It's like thinking that something like this is going to solve all of your problems, but it's not really. It's not always going to be solving the problem. It is a tool for it, but you still need to work on the internal things inside. And I really do love that. And even the wealthy of us, or the ones with driving their Ferraris, or the ones that are not, all need therapy. So yeah, I definitely hear that. So I want to kind of take a pivot towards looking at API women. And for us, it's the stereotype is like the A+ Asians. And I think that there's a lot of people in our community, especially for women, that feel like they can't make big strides in maybe wanting to pursue real estate, because they feel like they want to do all the research first and then kind of get it done. And at the base of it, they fear failure. And for me, I feel like I say all the time, it's like, if you're not failing at this, you're not doing it right.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, it's one of those things. It's the school of hard knocks, right? It's you have to have tried it, have to have learned from it in order to move forward. But it's it's a very big cost, and that's understandable. So, but let's look at the core. So, why do you think why API women feel like failure isn't an option?
I'll sort of take a very disparate three-prong approach. Part of the work starts in the family of origin, and I wanted to share a story that I shared with you all pre-show. I was speaking at a women's addiction conference, and you both realize now in your audience, like, I'm not female identifying. Like, so I just happened to be invited to speak at this conference this one day where the main speaker just basically opted out or called out, and so shared my concern about both substance addiction as well as process addictions that could be like gambling or workaholism, to be quite frank, or codependence. And so I thought I did okay enough, and that at the very end there was this tall white woman, in her 60s, and I was prepared for anything, Ashley and Anita. So she pauses for a bit and she says, "I really love working with Asian daughters. That's kind of my big practice now here in the Bay Area." And I was almost like ready to give her flowers at that point. And then she pivots and says, "Why are Chinese mothers such bitches?" Right? And sorry for the French term, but she just comes out and says, "Why are Chinese mothers such female dogs?" And I had to pick up my face off the floor, and as I imagine so many other people did. But I guess part of it's, I guess a good reframe would be she felt brave enough or courageous enough or reckless enough to bring this up in a public setting. And so I had to pause for a moment because I was thinking about the journey my family has taken where, again, I just lost my father, and I realized like what had happened is that both my parents have this set of very distant stories, distant timelines, where my mom was deprived of the opportunities to learn as much as perhaps you two have had, and many people in your audience. And so ended up being the dutiful housewife for 5 decades. And so she's just now coming to reckon with that. And so I was thinking about mom, but I was also thinking about how for my 3 older sisters, they're all wildly successful. They're all these really lovely API human beings that are involved in the community. And yet when it came to tending to my dad's caregiving the past 10 months and being with my mom, like they were the most tender they've ever been, as well as myself. And so to me, I think about how much we still crave attachment. There's a famous grief therapist named Dr. Rob Niemeyer. He works at Memphis State University. He says we are objects of impermanence looking for attachment in an impermanent world. Or so we're always craving for attachments in which we perceive to be permanent in an impermanent world. And that makes a lot of sense for an apartment building, right? That makes a lot of sense for a duplex. It makes a lot of sense for a retirement home in Ashland, Oregon, which is what I'm looking at right now next to the theater. Like, and it doesn't solve the fact that when stuff comes, grief and loss, life transitions, we're still asking for mommy or daddy. And so one of the other issues that comes up too is that there was a real huge period in the 90s and 2000s where a lot of well-meaning folks, like I won't say the background, would go and adopt kids from South Korea or China, and it was usually adorable girls, right? And what oftentimes happens is in the context of counseling the daughters, the adopted daughters, they were desperately craving reconnection with their birth parents. And so attachment as a theory is not just a theory, but attachment is something that I think we all desperately want beyond ownership of property or having a wonderful job, which many of your constituents have. But there's still that connection that's missing with folks. And that's why it's important to have training conferences in person as opposed to all online. The second one is more towards, and it's a little more ethereal. So stay with me on this. I think part of what happens in the American dream, and my colleague, Dr. Isala Mush-Sendeku, she's someone I love very dearly, almost like an aunt or a mom figure, emigrated from Ethiopia as a doctor, but was not eligible to even go to school here back in the 70s and 80s. And so now she's a licensed clinical social worker in East Bay. But she was talking about how the host country, meaning the US, has become increasingly hostile towards its immigrant populations or towards minorities. And so I think that breaks across the binary gender lines towards women. If you read Richard Roper's book, Boys and Men, or Men and Boys, he specifically describes that there's now a drop-off of highly educated men to highly educated women, which is great, right? Because for me, as someone that is learning more about liberation psychology and feminism, like it's good to have as many educated people that are in the workforce that hold wealth. And yet there's been this backlash either through direct sort of like, maybe it's an Asian dad going, why are you studying so hard, Anita? Like you should be focusing on getting your MRS degree, the Mrs. degree, or Ashley, hey, don't get the PhD because come on, like you don't want to be smarter than a lot of sort of old school village thinking that comes to the forefront that I might be inadvertently or maybe intentionally holding you back from achieving ownership, real estate ownership, but also like higher degrees and being around other highly successful women, right? And so I think that was one of the things that I would say is present in my family, where essentially what happens is some AAPI families end up being essentially, my colleague Yin Leach calls them CPUs, capitalistic production units. And so let's see how much Anita can make. Let's see whether Ashley can do better. Let's see if Gary can actually hold up his part and get his PhD. Like, so there's this competitive thing that looks like a foot race. And at the heart of it, those of us that have grown up here, we are competitive. I'll grant, none of the three of us got to where we're at without being competitive and strong. And yet at the heart of it, during the holidays, during the tough times, we crave mommy and daddy, or, two caregivers, right? And so there's a huge delta between that. The last one, the third one, is more, I think, there's just an issue with adjustment to any sort of failure, right? And so in the book, I purposely put the second chapter or the third chapter as failure to launch, because I'll use these two examples. In Canada, there's a huge issue with AAPI men that are not leaving the home. So they're essentially staying in their Canadian parents' basement in the big cities, or they are staying nearby. Even in my extended family, there's some really sad stories about folks that have never adulted. Sorry to make that into a verb, but like they've never adulted and they're living on government assistance, but they're also trying to make a living by, buying video games and replaying them and then selling them in the secondary market. And they're not necessarily moving towards the type of like white collar, blue collar employment that comes with what many of your constituents do. And so there's really sort of, I think, an indictment on how, whether it's that the men were spoiled, the men were not challenged enough, maybe the daughters were kept at home against their will, in terms of like staying close to mommy or daddy. But a lot of those still have in their roots a lot of family discord. Like there isn't a real sort of, I would call like a prime directive of like, we need to make sure all four of our kids do okay. And that was part of the example is that I'm not proud to say this out loud, but my dad would say, well, you don't have kids, Gary, so you should go help Lisa, help your sister through her divorce. And because, she's the one that's making all the money. And I'm like, I'm making okay money. Like I do enough for myself. But I think in my dad's sort of immigrantish, Chinesey mindset, he was saying that, well, we need to prop up the highest earning kid and then pay your social worker or therapist, so you go take care of their kids, right? So all of it is sort of in the behest of like keeping the wealth propped up in some form or manner. And I get it. I mean, I get it objectively as a man, but it's also that how hurtful, right? Because I don't have all this free time as a therapist. In fact, I probably have less free time than I did when I was doing consulting work, right? But I'm enjoying myself a lot more. Yeah. I hope all of those make sense.
I mean, it's so interesting too, and it's like a lot of those things are unspoken truths kind of thing, and so it's definitely something to just be more aware about as we kind of pass on knowledge and stuff through the generations and stuff. So so I want to move over to just kind of focusing on kind of real estate and kind of like the scarcity mindset and intergenerational wealth. And so obviously, we serve a community of real estate investors, and ownership is, something that holds a lot of emotional significance in Asian families. And so why do you think that is? Like, why does property ownership carry such emotional significance?
The first reason I think is I think the best reason, and the second reason I'll list is probably a little more contentious, but the first reason is, again, it gives if we can think about it intergenerationally, the one group of people, I think for your Japanese American audience, what I understand is that the third and fourth generation Japanese Americans, they are the ones that are now 2 generations removed from the internment camps, right, back in World War II. And so there's just a almost like a settled mental vantage point of like, wow, we've made it, right? I'm not saying unfortunately, but what happens is when you have a very, overseas born, I'm not saying situation, but overseas born family arrangement, and then they come to our shores, that the second generation often wields the most angst around wealth building, right? And so I think the turn I think people will make, and this also has to do with like gentrification of city centers, all these other issues that perhaps that I think you two are far more eligible to speak on, but to know that I can put everything into this one house, and if I buy this one house in Los Gatos from my friend, that if Anita and her family are struggling, they could come crash out. And Ashley, I don't know if you're wedded or not, but like, we could have you in the in-law unit, right? So the idea is that the real estate ends up being a real useful tool to determine, in my case, with dad gone, right, that mom can reasonably either live with one of the four of us, right, and she definitely has her favorite, which is, I don't think I'm one of them, but she definitely has her plan to like live, meaningfully and joyfully in her last few years, right, but with probably a sister that also happens to own pets, right? So there's that whole sort of like real estate as a and I always sucked at Monopoly as a game, but like I think it was because I wanted everyone to have property, and maybe that's more of like the socialist side coming out. But I see the value of knowing that if my niece, for instance, ever needed to couch surf, that she could crash out with me. If my nephew needed a place no more than 1 month in duration, but needed to crash out and maybe look for jobs, that he can always stay on our couch and raid our fridge, right? So I think there's that security that you two might have heard of, like Maslow's hierarchy of security back in the mid to late 20th century. And really, security looks a lot like housing. Now, on the other hand, I think we're in an interesting place here on the West Coast, where depending if it's Bellevue, Washington, or I'm just thinking of all these hotbeds, Bend, Oregon, or here in the Bay Area, I do fear this very strongly, that the housing can go beyond security and something that I can turn into generational wealth into status slash comparison symbols, right? And here's the one thing that happens. If, let's say, Ashley's in a 5,000 square foot unit duplex, and if Anita has a 6,000 square foot duplex and I have 8,000 square foot, yeah, right, I can put all the stuff, that it ends up sort of playing into the competitive juices that tend to break apart our communities. And again, I'm not against competition, but I also know that dissatisfaction with life, quality of life, tends to lead more towards anxious presentations or depression. So I see it more like a preventative thing, that for me, one of our dreams is to like settle either back in San Antonio, maybe not in the neighborhood I described to you guys, but to be back in my hometown. But we're also looking at Ashland, Oregon, because there's the closeness to Southern Oregon University if I wanted to teach. There's also the Shakespeare Festival. There's also a dog rehab facility there that again, I'm, as someone that is firmly convinced my wife to become more of a dog lover, like we could also, take care of dogs, rescue dogs. And so, but I think this part of California, especially in the South Bay, I don't know that as many people can do that sort of life planning, because the real wealth is tied up into the property, right? And so you two have probably heard the term like cash poor, asset rich, and that can be great, right? If I can turn, again, our 3 properties into, we could sell it and our family can move to maybe not Austin, but San Marcos, Texas, and buy a huge, thing by the lake, we can make it work, right? But it also means that issues like displacement, families moving away from each other. And when it came to my dad's care, one sister's in New Jersey, one sister's in Sacramento, near to my parents, which is great. But then the other 2 siblings are here in the Bay. And so it was always a 6-hour flight or a 3-hour drive. And so that has potential to really diminish sort of like the quality of the communities that are there. And so I realize, like, I hope I'm not offending too many people, but those are things that I'm seeing in practice, but also in my clinical practice, that sometimes the wealth is not enough, meaning that if I have places in Boise or Colorado, that there may still be a dissatisfaction, sort of like a chasing of the dream, so to speak. And that's, I am not linking this to this particular addiction, but in terms of the work I do with gambling addiction, it's often never enough to win that huge victory, but you're essentially chasing the next win. And so that can be, I don't know how much relevance that is to let's say real estate, but I could see someone that purchases a home to flip it and then may not be satisfied with even the profit that they make, because they could have done better in some form or manner. So I think part of it's just being content with what you have, but also being obviously looking at if there's more options to choose from. And yet at the end of the day, it's still you're still staring into your own mirror. You are living with yourself or your thoughts, right? And so it's still that we have to be with ourselves safely in those evenings, right? And that's Derek Thompson, he's a writer at The Atlantic. He talks about this being the loneliness century, and that's ultimately what I worry about. Is not that someone doesn't have property or security, but it's more that they don't have anyone to share that with, or to like share those experiences with. And so again, I really love hearing that there's real estate conferences in person, because for a while there, most of our CEUs and trainings were on Zoom, and good luck with me sitting in front of a screen for 4 hours, like listening to somebody. And so I really love that there seems to be like a real in-person component for real estate. That's maybe, even though we're on this podcast, but I think the expectation that there will be meetings later in the year is really neat to see. It's really neat to see community building again.
Well, I love that. Yeah, I think, well, just kind of to your other point, it's like I always hear the term comparison is the thief of joy. Yeah. And so I always try to remind myself that too, because I always feel like I'm in competition with myself or whatnot. And I think being content with yourself is always forgotten, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So okay, so why do some financially successful people still emotionally operate like they're one step away from losing everything? So kind of talking about the scarcity.
Yeah. I want to be careful in the way I'm saying this because again, part of it's I might be related to some of these folks I'm just about to talk about, but I think about those sort of more well-off enclaves here in the Bay Area, and so I do have two stories, and these are not fun ones to bring up, and so I trust that your audience will keep this to yourselves, all 5,000 of you. But one of the places I speak at about mental health, it is a church congregation, and one of the unfortunate things, and again, I trust you all to be able to find these sources of information on your own. But in last decade, one of the church leaders was caught embezzling quite 7 figures worth of money away from the church. And I have a real issue with that because again, it's like this is money that 7 million. I could think of a lot of things to do with 7 million, but particularly in the interest of people that are worshiping together. But what happened was that the English congregation imploded because of just the terrible things that this person did. And so the way I would describe it is they were given a blank check, and then they kept half of it illegally, and then gave the other half to the church. And so, however you feel about that ethically, but essentially they deprived the church of that investment. And so, and I'm a very curious sort. So, like, I just happen to know that my friend knew the kids, so knew the children. I'm like, I am just unabashedly curious about why, right? Because again, the we're in the Bay Area, so without saying, and what came out was essentially sort of what you were asking about, Ashley, is that the parents were concerned that there would not be enough generational wealth for the children and their children. So you can pocket 7 figures, and I can make that parlay into maybe 3 generations of wealth. And from a sicko's perspective, that makes sense. But from an ethical and legal perspective, to know that you already have, let's say, property here that's valued at far more than what I might get in San Antonio, Texas, and yet they still didn't feel like that was enough. And so that poverty mentality, and I'll just go there. It's, to me, I call it poverty mentality. It has the potential to destroy a lot of things, but particularly in the context of, like, I think to relational health, like to be generous with you all, to be generous with our time and resources. I just see it that if that poverty mentality kicks in with regards to wealth, it tends to splay out into other areas of life. And yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about, particularly when we think about the intersections of financially wealthy young men, but also a higher propensity for what I would call, well, you guys have heard of the term FAFO, right? So F around and find out, like a lot of those type of decision-making investment things, which tend to be sports betting, gambling, flipping houses, or trying to turn properties, right? And my understanding is it's a buyer's market now. I hope I got that right. And so folks are just panicking. I know some sellers that like are willing to drop their housing value, their sell value by half. And I'm like, what's the rush? Like, what's the need? Like, let's ride this thing out. But there's I think at the root of it is anxiety that's untreated, Ashley. But again, that's try telling someone that is dropping $1,000 at a blackjack table that they have anxiety, when they can be in denial and say, like, well, that $1,000 didn't mean anything to me, right? And so it's a weird, interesting mix that, like I mentioned, lower SES socioeconomic standing folks may not understand. And but also the other thing is I was in an Uber in Vegas last May, right after I published the book, and the gentleman was an Ecuadorian Uber driver, and so he asked, like, why would you write a book on Asian American mental health? You people have no problems, and like, you people, right? And so he sort of ended the ride with that, and I said, honestly, like, I get where you're coming from, and I would say 90% of my caseload is folks that largely don't have financial problems, but they have a lot of significant relationship and I would say just wellness problems, right? So I hope I answered that. And it's a real interesting question because there's one chart I meant to share with you guys, but essentially therapy and psychology support for the person themselves is seen as an added expense. So it's almost like, buying an extra chocolate cake, right? But if it's my daughters, Ashley and Anita, then I might be willing to skip out on my golf lessons. And so there's still that emphasis on the kiddos, but I hope that your audience is understanding, like, I can help the kids all I want, but if there's still marital discord in my relationship at 51, if there's ongoing, daddy mommy issues in terms of like the origin country, or if there's just what happens across generations is we need to house auntie so and so or grandma so and so, and I've seen just some horrendous decisions made by folks in the defense of preserving wealth, as opposed to the wealth has been built up so I can actually have this person and maybe not work for 6 months while AI is doing its thing, and then we can live comfortably with that. But the live comfortably may have been perverted in the way of like buying more property but not being able to enjoy it, and maybe that's the one I was really trying to end with.
Yeah. Okay. So as more Asian women directly inherit and control assets, what are some of the new emotional tensions you're seeing inside families and partnerships?
Yeah. One of the unfortunate things, I'll start with the toughest one first. Again, this is talk therapy, right? But I think some of the cases that I've worked with have really been about, hi, I'm married to Anita. We have two adorable kids, but and I don't think this is the case for Anita, but mom and dad are calling every day, and dad wants you to kick in $250K to like invest in his Malaysian business, and mom really is dissatisfied with dad. So can we buy them two houses? And these all are, if it were just to keep to like the financial wherewithal of this, we can make decisions on that, right? But there are hurt feelings. There are folks that never bargained for a dad or a mom or an in-law dad or mom to be knocking on their door asking for $500,000. And so those are things that I think outside of like good people like yourself doing more maybe fiscal literacy in terms of investment fiscal literacy. But what oftentimes happens in the absence of those lessons is daddy's calling, he's my dad, so I'm going to give him that 100K, and that might cause more disruption between the husband and wife. And so like you mentioned, I do think women have it a little bit more difficult because you can still be single, right? Powerfully single, or on the market, or however you would describe that. But when relatives come calling, the sort of draw of that looks a lot like, I provided for you, I came to the country for you, so you need to provide for me. And what do we do with those transactional relationships, right? Because it's easy to say, I buy property in Southeast San Antonio, I sell it to Anita and her husband. Like, those things make sense. But it's that I buy this because I'm trying to move my entire family from Taiwan into this house. I'm not certain my spouse will buy off on that, right? And so it's those sort of like familial decisions, but also those tend to reveal the second sort of interesting topic, Ashley, is around entitlement, like being owed something because you're my kids, or being owed something because I'm good looking. I'm owed something because I have these 12 properties to play with, and you better play ball. And all of those things, I think they tend to ring my legal ethical bell, because at the heart of it, my whole shtick is empathy, compassion, understanding, kindness. You studied this stuff, Anita, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, but especially self-control. And I worry about that self-control in the absence of like controls governing what I do, is basically saying, I get to do what I want with this investment, no matter how many people it hurts. And that can be a tough one to stomach if you're observing that from afar.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, I guess now we kind of want to move to just like, there's a lot of things that we can work through. And so like, how do we like heal from it? And how do we kind of see that in leadership and things like that? And so what does healthy ambition look like?
Yeah, healthy ambition. I will say, I will start with my little, I didn't include this acronym in the book because it's probably going to be in addition to Anita. So, but I use the term value. So the acronym value, and V stands for validating my people's experiences. So no matter what that person has described, I'm going to validate what they've gone through, because that is their lived experience. The A in value is acknowledging their emotions, and there's often emotions tied to it, right? And back to your previous question, Ashley, what I worry about for someone that is saying, I'm a wildly successful woman of means, and I'm just going to sit on it, right? And I'd rather that money be invested in, trips for the kids, experiences for the kids, or something. But I don't know that ultimately, again, this is just a therapist speaking or a psychologist speaking, but to have that ability to access properties and real estate and not do something investment related with them in terms of like uplifting others or uplifting humanity. And again, that sounds very socialist, but I wanted to put that out there. So the L is looking actively for support. And one of the interesting things about particularly group therapy, the research is bearing out that it's better for an Ashley, a Gary, or Anita, or anyone in the audience to seek out support from a group like group therapy or support groups than actually try to have those things be solved or addressed in the family system of origin, which is interesting, right? Because our families tend to be secretive anyways, if that's the case. And so what I would suggest is actually what you all do already, which is to have these business women have the access to local branches of SARE, or looking forward to a quarterly or annual conference, but also setting up these what I would call, sorry, I was going to say dine and dash. That's not the term. Like having sort of like these dessert dinner get-togethers regionally, and just to talk about what's causing me to stay up at night. Am I worried about PG&E not taking care of the shrubbery around the property? Those sort of things, right? But we're often taught to like hold those in and keep them within our family system. And if the family system is not open or available to talk about those things without like shaming, how dare you not know that you're supposed to clear the property around you before fire season or something like that. But those lessons are not there for a lot of female identifying folks because, again, from a patriarchal standpoint, dad holds all that data, right? Or dad refuses to teach mom, in my case, all of that helpful data. So the U is understand their origin story. So in pop culture, now we're trying to find out, everywhere from Thor's to Iron Man's to Superman's origin story, right? And yet I worry that not enough of us are looking at our own origin stories in terms of like what the relationships were like 1 to 2 to 3 generations before us. And so my colleagues and I will use this thing called the genogram, which is just a 3-generation relational diagram of how everyone gets along and what addictions people have or what issues people have. And it's a very nice representation, particularly for my engineers in the crowd or my IT people in the crowd, to look at what's going on there, as opposed to, well, Aunt Jane was always away at Christmas and Uncle Gary was always never around during Christmas. I wonder why. And never getting those answers right outside of those things. Finally, the E is embrace the present more. That's a lot of your mindfulness practices in terms of, one of the cool meditations I did with my patients today was having them imagine themselves getting into my Subaru and driving to Pismo Beach and just enjoying the beach for like an hour or two. And the meditation was only about 8 minutes, but a lot of them felt like they were there. They smelled the sea air, they smelled the seaweed, they were able to walk on a pier, all in their mind's eye, all in their memory, and all in their imagination. And so again, to walk you through the letters, so V is validate their experiences, A is acknowledge their emotions, L is look actively for support outside the family, U is understand their origin story, and then E is embrace the present more. And so this is the one case where I would say from a homogeneous standpoint, like I think it's good to have a lot of women that are interested in investing, particularly in the areas that we talk about, meet other folks that are interested, as opposed to try to work their networks from family of origin or going, paying money to go to a real estate class at an adult education place. Like you get to be around your peers and other folks that might own more wisdom. And for some odd reason, people feel better once they're around their peers and they feel like they're not being judged or misjudged for not having that knowledge in advance.
Yeah, I think I like the acronym, and I think those are some just good tools. And so would you say, like, what would be, like, if someone wants to move the needle and make real change today, like what would be like that one piece of advice or tool or practice?
Yeah, the first part makes me sound like Dave Ramsey, but I think the amount of debt that you're willing to sit with, right? Because right. I mean, I know interest rates are always a problematic thing, but I just think like holding what I would call unsecured debt, and that can be credit card debt, but also like you might owe Auntie Joyce $18,000, right? I think that sooner that you can pay off those sort of like things where people can attach their tendrils to you and keep a hold of you in terms of relational control. So lower debt, or maybe erasing the debt altogether, that's not necessary. But I also think like to some of the more, to me, I call them more simplistic things. there was a real phase, I think, when Anita was growing up, and maybe Ashley when you're growing up. There was this thing in the 90s about like surpassing your limits and exceeding what you could possibly tolerate, right? And those people, I think, are dead. They're largely gone. They're out of the public sphere, right? Because what people like myself discovered was, wow, sleep is good. Like having a routine and having a sleep hygiene of 8.5 a night is really good. Having 3 square meals of medium quality is excellent. But also getting together with my sisters at Valley Fair and let's go just do a walk and talk thing, and then celebrate with a cup of coffee at a reasonably priced cup of coffee, maybe at Nordstrom's, right? So, but that togetherness was really sort of imploded or exploded during COVID. And so I think people like yourselves are reestablishing those tendrils again, where people can connect with each other. So sleep hygiene. I'm not saying that we all need to get into like Spartan race shape, but I think tending to our physical wellness is all right. And then there's this really big thing about nature, and it doesn't have to be like setting up a yurt in Half Moon Bay, but there's just something that improves about mental wellness when you're out in nature or out in nature with other people. You know, there's plenty of trails here in the South Bay and around the Bay Area, but there's no accident why, Anita and Ashley, why you see everyone get onto Highway 17 Saturday and Sunday morning to get the heck out of the valley to go to the beach. And then those same people are crowding back the freeway, heading back at 6 p.m. They know to get away from this place, right? Because this place can also induce anxiety because, maybe they live 2 miles from their tech company, right? Yeah.
Okay. Last question here is, what's one thing you hope the next generation does differently around money, success, or emotional health?
Yeah. I would say, without sounding like a dork, investing in your emotional health. And that could be reading, Jenny Wong's book. It could be, reading Kathy Park Hong's poetry book that she actually did a public reading at my school, which I missed because I was doing caregiving, but I would have loved to attend that. But I think investing back in the humanities is one thing. And that's what I mean. Is like, it's not just enough to have the retirement home or the multiple retirement homes or to rent out to other people, but it's doing something productive with that money or with those funds, and to invest in the betterment of perhaps training younger female cohorts, right? I think investing into SARE and maybe doing financial literacy talks in high schools, right, or in junior colleges. But for me, it's more of like thinking about expansive options as opposed to I'm going to constrict myself into myself and only look at my investments once a day and eat my bowl of cereal. Like that loneliness existence or that solitary existence only works if you're trying to do like religious, spiritual stuff. If you're constantly alone, that can really do some doozies in terms of like mental health, particularly with depression and sometimes anxiety.
Cool. Well, this was such a good conversation, Gary. I appreciate the time today, and there's a lot of really good just information and maybe hard truths that we talked about today. And so, but I love that you have the tools and you have resources that can help solve for a lot of these, or at least move the needle forward. Yeah. So Gary, if people want to get in touch with you, how can people get in touch?
Yeah. I'll share my email with both of you, or y'all have the email that I use. I don't, and they tell therapists not to maintain too much of a social media presence. And so probably the best way is to email. If I'm thinking ahead to like, if you need mental health support, I'm not necessarily opening my doors. I know it sounds very terrible to say out loud, but I'm also someone that knows a lot of therapists that could possibly meet with you. And so don't be a stranger. I hope that this was a useful and beneficial hour for so many of you, because maybe it's the one thing that you've been holding on to and wondering what to do with it.
Yeah, cool. Well, thanks again, Gary. We'll catch you next time on the SARE Ladies Podcast.
Thank you, you too.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the SARE Ladies Podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, make sure to follow, share, and leave us a review. It helps more women in real estate find this community. And don't forget to connect with us at sareladies.com for more resources, stories, and support on your investing journey. Until next time, keep building, keep learning, and keep breaking barriers.